April 1994, Wells Fargo Bank, Seattle. In the days before Kurt Cobain's body was discovered, his bank account showed unusual activity. Large cash withdrawals, transfers to accounts that investigators never fully traced, and one particularly significant transaction: substantial payment to someone whose identity was never publicly revealed. When private investigator Tom Grant reviewed Kurt's financial records as part of his investigation, this transaction stood out. Not because of the amount alone, but because of the timing, the recipient, and the questions it raised that were never answered by the official investigation. This is the story of Kurt Cobain's final financial transactions and the mystery recipient who received money just before his death. Before I tell you about the specific transaction that raised so many questions, you need to understand the financial situation Kurt Cobain was in during his final weeks. Kurt had significant wealth. Nirvana had sold millions of albums. There were royalties, touring revenue, and various business interests. Kurt's personal finances were complicated, involving multiple accounts, management companies, and legal structures. But in the weeks before April 1994, Kurt's financial activity became unusual. Large cash withdrawals, payments to individuals not connected to his normal business operations, transactions that didn't match his typical spending patterns. Some of these transactions have reasonable explanations. Others remain mysterious decades later, and one transaction in particular, made in the final days before his death, has never been adequately explained. This is that story. To understand why certain transactions were unusual, we need to understand Kurt's normal financial patterns. Kurt Cobain was worth millions by 1994, but he wasn't particularly interested in money management. He had accountants, business managers, and lawyers handling most of his financial affairs. His day-to-day expenses were managed through credit cards and checking accounts that were monitored by his management team. Kurt didn't think about money much, said Danny Goldberg, his manager. He had enough that he didn't worry about it, but he wasn't extravagant. He'd spend on instruments, art supplies, things for Francis, but he wasn't buying cars or jewelry or typical rock star stuff. Kurt's regular expenses were predictable: mortgage and property expenses for the Lake Washington house, studio time and musical equipment, art supplies and books, medical expenses and prescriptions, household expenses for his family, legal fees related to various matters. These expenses created a pattern that accountants and business managers could track and anticipate. But starting in late March 1994, that pattern changed. According to financial records that were later reviewed by private investigators and discussed in various accounts, Kurt's banking activity in late March and early April showed several unusual transactions. Large cash withdrawals. Kurt withdrew significant amounts of cash, amounts much larger than his typical withdrawals. When someone usually takes out $200 at a time and suddenly starts withdrawing thousands, that's notable. Cash withdrawals are particularly interesting to investigators because they're hard to trace. Once money becomes cash, it's difficult to determine where it went or what it was used for. Unusual pays. Several checks were written to individuals who weren't part of Kurt's normal circle of business associates, employees, or service providers. These payments didn't match obvious categories like medical expenses, legal fees, or equipment purchases. Timing. The transactions occurred during a period when Kurt was known to be struggling significantly after the Rome incident, during attempts at intervention, and in the days after he left the Exodus Recovery Center in Los Angeles. Tom Grant, the private investigator hired by Courtney Love to find Kurt after he left rehab, later gained access to some of Kurt's financial records as part of his investigation. What he found raised questions. Among the various unusual transactions, one stood out: a substantial payment made to an individual whose identity has never been publicly confirmed. According to accounts from those who reviewed the financial records, this transaction occurred in the days immediately before Kurt's death was estimated to have occurred. The amount was significant, in the thousands of dollars range, and the recipient was not someone from Kurt's known circle of friends, business associates, or service providers. What made this transaction unusual? The timing. It occurred in what would turn out to be the final days before Kurt's death, during a period when he was reportedly alone and isolated. The amount it was larger than typical personal transactions Kurt made. The recipient, the person or entity receiving the payment, was not part of Kurt's regular financial picture. They weren't a known friend, employee, dealer, or business associate. The lack of explanation. There was no obvious purpose for the payment based on Kurt's known activities or needs during that period. The investigation's disinterest. Despite the unusual nature of the transaction, official investigators apparently didn't pursue it as a significant lead. Tom Grant, who has spent decades raising questions about the official narrative of Kurt's death, has pointed to this financial transaction as one of several unexplained elements that deserve more thorough investigation. When someone makes an unusual payment right before they die, that's something investigators should examine carefully, Grant has argued. Who received the money? Why? What was it for? These are basic questions that should have been answered. Grant's theory, and it's important to note that it remains a controversial theory, not accepted by official investigators, is that this payment might indicate Kurt was planning something, meeting with someone, or involved in a situation complex than the official suicide determination suggests. Questions that were never publicly answered. Who received the payment? The identity of the recipient has never been publicly disclosed. Was it someone helping Kurt with something? Someone he owed money to? Someone he was meeting with? What was the payment for? Was it for services, goods, repayment of a debt, something else entirely? Did the recipient come forward after Kurt's death? If they had a legitimate business relationship with Kurt, did they contact authorities or Kurt's estate after his death? Was the recipient investigated? Did Seattle police or other investigators attempt to identify and interview this person? It's important to consider possible explanations for the transaction that don't involve conspiracy or foul play. Drug purchase. The most straightforward explanation might be that Kurt was purchasing drugs. Large cash transactions and payments to individuals outside one's normal circle are common in illegal drug transactions. Kurt was struggling with addiction, and making such a payment would not be unusual in that context. Private service. Kurt might have hired someone for a private service he didn't want others to know about anything, from a counselor to a legal consultant to something else entirely legitimate, but private. Old debt. The payment might have been settling an old debt or obligation that Kurt felt needed to be resolved. People sometimes settle financial matters when they're contemplating major life decisions. Incomplete information. Those who have discussed the transaction publicly may not have complete information. The actual purpose might be documented somewhere in records that aren't publicly available. Personal matter. The transaction might involve a personal matter that has nothing to do with Kurt's death, but that his family and estate chose to keep private for legitimate reasons. Beyond this single significant transaction, Kurt's broader financial behavior in his final weeks suggests someone either preparing for something or struggling with decision-making. Multiple large cash withdrawals could indicate paying for things he didn't want. Trace. Preparing to leave or disappear. Poor judgment due to substance use. Planning for an extended period of isolation. Financial experts note that unusual spending patterns can sometimes indicate suicidal ideation, giving away possessions, settling debts, or making final arrangements. However, they can also indicate other major life changes, like planning to leave a seizure or start over somewhere new. Changes in financial behavior can signal various things, explains Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist. Sometimes people settling their affairs are preparing for suicide. Sometimes they're preparing to run away. Sometimes they're just making poor decisions due to substances or mental health struggles. You can't determine intention from financial records alone. According to Tom Grant and others who have raised questions about the investigation, Seattle police did not thoroughly investigate Kurt's financial transactions in the days before his death. The official investigation concluded suicide relatively quickly, within days of discovering the body. The determination was based primarily on the presence of a note interpreted as a suicide note, the shotgun and physical evidence at the scene, Kurt's known struggles with depression and addiction, no obvious signs of forced entry or struggle, Financial records were not, apparently, a significant focus of the investigation. This is actually common in suicide cases where the physical evidence seems clear-cut. Investigators typically don't conduct extensive financial forensics unless there's reason to suspect foul play. But critics argue that unusual financial activity in the days before death should trigger more thorough investigation, even in apparent suicides. If someone is making unusual payments in transactions right before they die, that's relevant information. Tom Grant has argued. It could explain what they were doing, who they were meeting with, what their state of mind was. It's basic detective work. Seattle police have maintained that their investigation was thorough and that the evidence clearly supported the suicide determination. They've suggested that much of the speculation about unexplained details is based on incomplete information or misunderstanding of investigative procedures. The mysterious payment represents a broader pattern in the Kurt Cobain case, details that seem significant but that were never fully explained in public. Other unexplained elements have included the timeline of events in Kurt's final days, the high level of substances in his system and questions about his ability to function, various witnesses who reported unusual observations, physical evidence that some investigators found questionable. The financial transaction is one piece of a larger puzzle that some people believe has missing pieces. For those who accept the official determination of suicide, these unexplained details are simply the normal ambiguities present in any complex case. Not everything gets explained. Not every question gets answered. That doesn't mean the ergo conclusion is wrong. For those who question the official narrative, these unexplained details represent investigative failures, questions that should have been pursued, but weren't, evidence that should have been examined more carefully, but was dismissed. The financial records that have been discussed publicly show a pattern that is open to interpretation. Fact: Kurt made unusual financial transactions in his final weeks, including large cash withdrawals and payments to individuals outside his normal circle. Fact: one significant payment occurred in the days immediately before his death, to a recipient whose identity has not been publicly confirmed. Fact: these transactions were not thoroughly investigated as part of the official inquiry into Kurt's death. Interpretation varies. Some see this as evidence of nothing more than a struggling addict making poor financial decisions, possibly buying drugs or paying for things he wanted kept private. Others see this as evidence that Kurt was planning something, meeting with someone, or involved in a situation that wasn't fully investigated. Still others see this as a missing piece of information that we simply can't evaluate properly without more details. What's clear is that the transaction occurred, was unusual compared to Kurt's normal financial behavior, and was never fully explained in public records about his death. The story of Kurt Cobain's final financial transactions, particularly the significant payment to an unknown recipient, remains one of many unresolved details surrounding his death. For most people, including official investigators, these financial matters don't change the fundamental conclusion: Kurt Cobain died by suicide, a tragic end to a life marked by chronic pain, depression, and addiction. The financial transactions, whatever they were for, don't override the physical evidence at the scene or the documented struggles Kurt faced. For others, including Tom Grant and various independent investigators, these unexplained financial transactions represent legitimate questions that deserve answers. Who received the money? Why? What was Kurt doing in those final days? Who was he heat with? Without access to complete financial records and investigative files, the public cannot fully evaluate these questions. We're left with partial information, competing interpretations, and the frustration of unresolved mysteries. What we can say definitively: financial records show unusual activity in Kurt's final weeks. A significant payment was made to someone not part of Kurt's normal circle. This transaction was not thoroughly investigated publicly. Multiple interpretations of these facts are possible. The official cause of death determination was not based primarily on financial evidence. Whether these financial transactions matter to understanding what happened to Kurt Cobain depends largely on what conclusion you've already reached about his death. They're either minor details in a tragic suicide or significant clues that were never properly prepared. The truth, as always, is probably more complex than either narrative allows. Critical declaration. This video presents documented evidence and unresolved questions for educational discussion purposes only. What we know: Kurt Cobain's official cause of death, suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound, April 5th. Financial records show unusual activity in his final weeks. A significant payment was made to an unidentified recipient. This transaction was not publicly investigated in depth. What we don't know: the identity of the payment recipient, the purpose of the transaction, whether it has any connection to Kurt's death, whether it was investigated privately but not disclosed. This video does not claim to know what happened, make definitive accusations, ignore the official investigation's findings, dismiss Kurt's documented mental health struggles. This video does present documented financial evidence, raise legitimate investigative questions, encourage critical thinking, allow viewers to evaluate information themselves. Kurt Cobain's death was officially determined to be suicide. This remains the conclusion of Seattle Police and the King County Medical Examiner. This video presents unresolved questions for discussion, not definitive answers.